All right, there was a lot of information in the other video. I have part 1, which is how I assessed the source, got all my materials, knew that I would be doing this in a simplified 3-value study. And the reason we call it a study is we are thinking this through. We are studying and thinking, as drawing is a form of thinking, how we can interpret and translate this realistic with all the values kind of a source into something that is more simplified. So I'm going to get right into shading this. This will be a quicker video just because I'm not thinking as much right now. All the thinking happened in the first video where I assessed this, I shape designed, I thought of my shape language, and everything is mapped out here. So now I just need to keep it all straight. What's black, what's midtone, and what is the white of the page? I'm going to put in my blacks first. It's nice to get that separation of dramatic contrast, I think, first. Copic shell markers have the 2-tone tip, the brush fine detail tip, and then the chisel tip on the other side. So just be careful, get used to it with just the differences there. I'm still getting used to it. I'm gonna set the source aside. Never totally put the source away. You should always be referring to it. However, if you've done the work and you already know where things are gonna go, I can start to fill this in, because at this point, I'm filling in my kind of homemade color by number. And however you think should be the way that you do this. In life, the ends don't really justify the means, but in some things, the ends justify the means. It just depends on what it is. And with something like this, being very careful there. I have a little bit of a nodule, but that's okay. All right. With art, sometimes the ends very much justifies the means because it's how you get there. However your brain thinks, whatever your process is. So what I mean by that is, as you're mapping this out, if you need to shade in your shape so you know what needs to be black or gray, or if you want to put little numbers in there and associate, you know, the number 1 is black, the number 2 is gray. If you want to put a B in the shapes for whatever is black or whatever is, you know, gray will be G or whatever. Now, I want to pause. I just filled that in. That looks pretty cool so far. You know, we've got that nice mass of black value. I forgot to talk about this in the other video, but I just remembered it now as I'm shading this in. And this is pretty cool. I want to think about details. Now, remember, there were a couple of things that we omitted from the first video when we're considering what, when we simplify, should we omit and then our drawing still retain its integrity. And we omitted the pores. You know, there's so many of those details. We're omitting the texture there of the table. We're omitting little nodules there. Even without saying it, we omitted the veins and some of the details of the texture of that leaf. We omitted that little guy that we don't need, that little, you know, crevice in there. But there are some things that you can hint to the viewer of details about what it is that you're drawing, that without doing it everywhere, if you just hint in a particular place, the brain of your viewer will be able to carry that through the entire piece of artwork. And this is what I want to show you. We have these nice pores that are characteristic of a lemon. This still looks like a lemon, right? But what could we do about this texture to still give it the tribute it deserves without putting it everywhere and giving us a headache? Well, we can put a little bit of it maybe right along the edge of where the dark meets the mid-tone. Typically, details actually look the most saturated or the most potent right at that mid-tone area. Anything in the light side tends to get overexposed or blown out, so you don't see as many details there. Anything in the dark shadows, it's a little bit too dark to see that information, so you tend to see the most contrast of information, the most detail right in this general area of the mid-tone, kind of where the two merge, and it's not too dark to see, it's not too overexposed to see. So it would be kind of fun to put just a couple, and again, I'm using my pencil just so that if I want to move these guys around, I could. Some of these I don't really like where they are going. If I was really serious about this, I might get a source to see how another artist did something like this. But this is my thought process, and this is what I'm doing. I'm giving a little bit of that extra texture in the midtone area, okay? So notice this area of the lemon. We can see a lot of those pores very poignantly right next to this core shadow. I'm using the design element of the rhythm of large progressing in like a decrescendo into something small, so very large. So these bumps are large. We're slowly in rhythm and movement bringing it out into the flesh of the lemon with smaller dots. And I'm going from many and almost that pyramid formation to small as we bring that out there, which is similar to what I'm doing with these tapered shapes anyways, you know, big to small, big to small. I'm using that for the shapes right there. So that is something that you can incorporate right there as a little added cherry on top with the details. You can always hint at it, thinking through your design elements and principles with that. All right, coming back to shading, because that's what this video is about. I recommend doing the darks first, at least with the Copic markers, because when we get to the mid-tone grays, that gray marker will be able to bleed itself into wherever you put the black, and the black will just absorb it. So what I mean is you don't have to worry about being super meticulous coloring inside the lines. If you're butting up the gray up to the black will just absorb it. You do need to be careful with your mid-tone grays when they are butting up next to what should be white because the white is not being painted in. That is the white of the page. So you need to think ahead and make sure that that's gonna still look nice. Because of the shape of the nibs, we have some inherent shapes just by putting down a mark with our markers. So use that to your advantage. The chisel tip gives you this like broad rectangle shape. The brush tip, you can come up with different shapes depending on your pen pressure. But just keep that in mind and use that to your advantage. It's part of practicing with the medium, practicing with your tools. Okay. Be careful of shapes bleeding into each other. I mentioned before that can be super cool, can also be super detrimental. It's detrimental when a shape of value bleeds into a shape of the same value, and therefore without the contrast, you can't tell what that object or subject is anymore. So this shape of black that I'm filling in right now, I'm gonna go ahead and fill it all in. Remember, this is the shadow side, or that dark of the leaf here of my lemon. Here we go. Remember, it's got this cast shadow. And the cast shadow is wrapping around the lemon itself. So this is not part of the leaf, it's part of the lemon. That needs to be black, right? Because everything here is mid-tone gray. Notice that that cast shadow then is going to bleed into, it's going to become the same shape as this leaf. Now, it's not detrimental, like it doesn't look bad that way. We're not losing information necessarily. Could someone come up and recognize that that is the cast shadow rather than, oh, it's, you know, part of the leaf? Not necessarily. So just be aware of that. Okay, this, like I said, is not a big deal, but that is something that you're going to want to think ahead. Where are your value shapes? Do you need contrast between them? Make sure that you that you put a shape of contrast if you need to have something separate. One of the beautiful things about reflected light is like nature kind of does that for you in the sense of, because of the light bouncing back from the table, it does visually lighten this area. But if this shadow just seeped into, you know, if we squinted in this, you know, seeped into that, we wouldn't have the separation for this nice edge of the lemon. The lemon is not made up of pencil lines. The lemon is literally made up of just different shapes of value that are butted up next to each other. Like that's what reality is. So if we're just dealing with edges of value shapes, make sure that if you need a contrast separation, that you as the designer put it in there, regardless if the source has it or not. Now in this case, like I said, I'm just going to keep this. And in this case, we've got the nice reflected light right here. So I do have that natural separation that I have accounted for by not placing my core shadow right up next to the edge. But if I did, those shapes would bleed into each other and they would become just one solid shape. Again, that is a super cool technique that designers will use when they're working with positive and negative shapes. Notice I'm using right now kind of something that looks like positive and negative shapes with my, you know, my black and my white so far. However, you know, if you've got something that works with a shape bleeding into another shape, use it. If it's going to hinder the structure of what it is you want your viewer to see, then that could be a problem. All right, I am done with my black. Let's get the midtone. The black covers very well. You'll notice as you use the gray midtone that this doesn't cover in the same way if you go like really fast or don't really allow that ink to really dye the page. You can see your stroke directions, which isn't a bad thing. This is a little extra, but you can use that to your advantage. If you know you can already see the stroke direction, you can do what I'm doing here and you can use that to your advantage. You know this is a cylindrical lemon, or spherical, sorry. You know this is a spherical lemon. Therefore, go ahead and get your brush strokes to also reflect those contour directional lines. You know, we have this nice curvature there. It's just an added technique that as the designer you can use to your advantage. Okay, this is where I need to be careful. I'm butting myself up next to my lightest lights. I'm going to slow down, take my time. And as a designer, one of the job descriptions you could argue is if you make a mistake, the designer's job is to work with it and make it look good in the end. So if you do make a mistake, pretend you meant it. And do your best to cover it up and make it look deliberate. Sometimes mistakes are actually helpful. You don't recognize it until the mistake happens and then you're like, oh, that actually looks pretty cool. Some mistakes are just terrible and you're just like, oh my goodness. And some mistakes are not revocable. Like some of them legitimately, you just have to start over. Okay, so what I'm doing there is just helping to camouflage some of the strange strokes right there. Okay. Here we go. All right. And as just kind of a final touch, Just to help out this leaf, I'm just going to put a little bit of an indication. I'm going to bring that value all the way to the edge there. And I could also, so feel free to use your thin part of your marker to do maybe some extra details. Don't go crazy. A little goes a long way. Like, I'm not going to be doing much with this. That's probably it. But get out of your brain the thought that you're using lines and get into your brain thinking that you're using shapes. And even though the shape might be thin and look like a line, it's just a thin shape, because that's going to help your brain assess value shapes and what you can do. Now, as just some end notes here, if I squint, overall, my lemon is much darker than this lemon. And that's because I chose my mid-tone gray. It's pretty dark on the page, right? It's kind of like a dark mid-tone. So now that I know that, if I were to do this lemon again, I'd probably have the white of the page be a larger surface area and have maybe a smaller ridge of mid-tone. But this still works. This still looks like a lemon. We've still simplified it. We just have a dark lemon. It's like a lemon at night with a nice little highlight right there. But that is something to consider, is when you have solutions, you can now take a look at your solutions the first go round, look at the source, and maybe ask yourself, what could I have done different that could have still been a strong solution? So as I'm looking at this, one of those things would be, next time have a larger surface area be the white of the page. Another thing is, maybe I would also allow a little bit more highlights to show up in the leaf. Maybe like down in here or something, just a little bit, maybe some veins that I would leave white, possibly a little highlight right there, just to give some nice added variety. We want unity with variety, and I've got the structure that unity gives here with my limited value palette, with the structure of the drawing. Variety allows me to have those contrasts of little pops of contrasting values. So that's probably what I would do different, but this is how you would do a 3-value study with a lemon.